Great. So we were talking about IM, talking about investment companies.
And the color of the red book.
And we established, you took credit for that.
Well, you know, I give Stanford University credit for their colors, but it had to be some color.
Yeah. You talked about money market funds, which
Yes.
of course has saved the middle class, but also saved investment companies, I think, to some degree. Another technology that's coming along and changing the industry is exchange-traded funds. And you were in the seat to approve those or not to approve those, is that right?
Yes, the Spider was the first, and there had been a long struggle, to just give a little historic context, there had been a long struggle for a decade or more as the futures markets developed, financial futures, to manage risk and to allow people to trade in baskets securities. And for a long time there had been arguments about whether that should be regulated. Stock index futures should be regulated at the SEC rather than the CFTC, and they should do agriculture, we should do finance. I didn't think that was particularly important because they could do it and we could do it, but it just wasn't the end of the world. What was most important to me was the exclusivity clause of the Commodities Exchange Act, which said that if something involves futurity, that it had to be traded on the board of a commodities exchange. And that, I think, had an innocent original intent of making sure that hog bellies were not traded out on the street corner, but we had passed well beyond that, and that innocent provision, and whenever government creates monopolies, it is playing with fire and a very dangerous thing for the public, and that's what happened here. So the futures exchanges seized on the exclusivity clause and then became extremely skilled at bringing cases against the securities exchanges if they tried to develop any new innovative products for trading baskets of securities, alleging that those should be traded only on a futures exchange. And we were really struggling with it because if it didn't get fixed some way, then trading in equity instruments, baskets, groupings of equities would move to London, where they were not burdened by the idiocy of an exclusivity clause to take trading in equities and force it onto hog belly exchanges. And I don't mean to be, this is the old rivalries, but I mean the Chicago Board of Trade and the Chicago Merc, where most of the S&P 500 futures contracts were being traded, were perfectly professional organizations and intelligent people, and I was happy to have them trading. We didn't want to stop them from trading whatever they wanted to trade. We just didn't want them stopping evolution and innovation in the securities markets purely to transfer income out of New York City to Chicago. That, you know, there should be good, healthy competition and let people list products on the Chicago Merc or on the New York Stock Exchange, whichever they preferred. Let customers buy them wherever they found the market to be best. But that wasn't what the law said, and we struggled with that. At any rate, as usual, the market is much better at fixing problems like that than the political system. And so people had developed a Spider, which was the earliest ETF. And the concept was it wasn't a futures contract on the S&P 500. It was a basket of equities and that could be traded as a group to replicate really what was being done in Chicago, but it replicated in a different way that didn't trigger the exclusivity provision of the Commodities Act. And so I thought it was a great thing, a wonderful development, when I heard about it from Mary Ann, and she starts explaining to me that we have this proposal. And actually, the Spiders product had been pending at the commission for a couple of years and had been sitting there gathering dust. And again, it was one of these innocent, relatively innocent things. CorpFin has a deep-seated belief that if you're going to sell anything, it has to be preceded by delivery of a prospectus, and that is a matter of religious belief. It's also the law, but it goes way beyond the law into religious belief. And Market Reg has views about how trading has to happen. And investment management has a statute that says you have to value something on its net asset value at 4 o'clock every afternoon, and that makes it impossible to trade it at 12:30 p.m. when you happen to want to trade it, because now you have a very stale price and you have to wait until the next day. Well, waiting is not a good thing for markets. Markets like to be able to react and react quickly, and time is money. And so if you realize that something is overvalued or undervalued, you want to trade on that, not wait till 9 o'clock the next morning when the rest of the world has woken up to what you perceived and could have traded on profitably. So the whole idea of having markets is have them open, have them liquid, have them able to trade. And the Spider, which was a method of doing that, having something continuously traded, but that was a basket, collided with the 4 o'clock rule at FIM, and it collided with the prospectus rule, because if you jump in and buy the Spider, you don't have time to get a prospectus. And in fact, it's not an IPO, it's not a 33 Act offering, it's continuously traded. So we had, from one division's perspective, they had a square peg trying to fit in a round hole. From another division's perspective, they had a round peg trying to fit in a square hole, and the other division thought it was a triangle. You know, it was a perfectly legitimate product, but each of the divisions had well, this isn't the way we do business. They should change the product to accommodate the way the staff does business. And after listening to everybody, I said, all right, guys, well, you know, what makes the SEC different is, instead of telling the market that it has to accommodate to our preferences, we have to learn what the market develops and what the investing public wants, and then we have to make sure that our concerns about disclosure and fairness and manipulation and the perfectly legitimate reasons why we regulate trading in things are done, even though it's a round peg. So figure it out. And I can't remember, but I think I mentioned when I would thinking about putting this on the calendar for an open commission meeting and voting it through, whether they were ready or not. And so they could either saddle their horses and get it done.
They being the commissioners or the
No, they being the division directors.
Yeah, okay.
And I just was of the view that the years they had spent thinking about this were long enough, and that, you know, if people had legitimate concerns about the product, let's try it. We'll watch it, put it in the marketplace, see if the public wants this. This may be an academic discussion. You might make it available, nobody trades it. Or, as actually happened, you make it available, and I don't know, today there's $4.5 or $5.5 trillion of what we now call ETFs rather than spiders. So it was an opportunity to, and there were a lot of areas where when I came to the commission, I had a background of worrying about overly broad regulation across the government. I'd seen it in area after area where you had at its kernel something that needed to be done. But if at the time a statute was drafted or a regulation was written, if it is written too broadly and the targeting of the regulatory response becomes too broad, then you can have tremendous costs, either in compliance costs, too many lawyers, too many pieces of paper have to be filed, or costs in terms of the drag on innovation and less economic activity without reason. So this was an area where each of the divisions had legitimate concerns based on the SEC's experience, based on our statutes. But those concerns just didn't happen to be applicable. They were technically applicable, but this was just a new kind of a product. And so you had to find a way to harmonize the issue of, well, is prospectus delivery really that important in this kind of a product? And is the 4 p.m. rule important in this kind of a product? Is the trade reporting, or the market reg always has 97 reasons why something needs a 5-year proceeding.
So,
I love them, but they can take forever, or at least in my era, they could take forever. I actually put a rule in, informally, with market regs saying that when they sent me a letter to sign, we would get a lot of 1,200 or 1,300 letters a year to Congress, and many times it was about things in market reg, and I told them, henceforth, they could not send me a letter that had more than 75 footnotes, because at the time they would send me a letter to sign and with 300 footnotes, and I said, this we've got to be more economical. I can't read all these footnotes. And
so was this a matter of an exemption to the 40 Act, just making ETFs?
well, I think we had to do some form of exemption under the 33 Act and under the 34 Act and under the 40 Act. But we certainly had to adjust things that the divisions were doing, their normal guidance and policies. And I can't remember all the technicalities other than that, you know, we sat and discussed it among the division directors. Nobody could give me a reason that the public was actually going to be harmed. It was just, well, but we'd rather have them have the prospectus, or we'd rather have them, you know, have the NAV at 4 o'clock. So it was just an example of some inertia that you had to want something to happen. And I, frankly, at the time we did it, I didn't know whether that product would be wildly successful or not successful at all. How do you know? But my view is, and the general philosophy of the securities laws on a disclosure-based system, is you can create and trade anything as long as you describe all the facts about it. So you don't have to come in and get a permit from the government to develop, you know, a convertible bond or a pipe or some kind of variation of new form of trading something in the marketplace. We allow for that innovation, and then the philosophy is that government can come along later and control any abuses, but you didn't have the, forget the phrase they used to use in interstate commerce and public convenience where you have to prove ahead of time in a litigated proceeding that you really need this product. Well, let it fly. And that's what we did with ETFs, and obviously it transformed the marketplace as we knew it then compared to today. Another thing that did the same thing was electronic trading. And we had, I can remember John Dingell, Chairman Dingell of the Energy and Commerce Committee, who was by far the most powerful member of Congress at the time, telling me in no uncertain terms that allowing electronic trading systems was completely unlawful, and that the Exchange Act had various provisions requiring exchanges to be in mutual form and not to be profit-making entities and all these different attributes of things. And of course, computers had come along, and now it was possible to do what the New York Stock Exchange does in a black box. or a green box for that matter, but in any kind of a box. And now the exchanges would argue they did it better than a machine could do, but you could run the machine in all the off hours when the exchange wasn't open, so that instead of having 18 or 19 hours of illiquidity, you could have a place to trade. And of course, you didn't need to have all the humans making an income, and therefore you could reduce the costs of trading with electronic networks and access more pool, lots and lots of reasons. So and I think the Reuters had perhaps gotten the first, Instanet was, I think, one of the first experiments in that. And I remember there was a period of time where I signed about 24 exemptive letters to allow new forms of electronic crossing networks, which were really exchanges in another name, but they needed to be named something else not to violate the provisions of the 34 Act. And I figured if Chairman Dingle was going to put me in jail, I might as well give him lots of counts to do it. And so we unleashed electronic trading to great results. Now, I'm not a fan of dark pools, and I'm not a fan of some of today's manifestations of what can be done electronically. So I deeply believe in transparency, and there are serious risks of front-running and things of that kind. There are reasons why you look carefully at how anybody is trading securities to make sure that the customers are at least aware of the risks of how things unfold. But we had erred on this as a nation. The last time the trading markets had really been studied seriously was the special study of the SEC, which was 74, 75, that area.
64.
64.
Yeah.
So it had been decades, during which time, now, the revolution in technology and communications as of 1989 and 1990, when I'm sitting there worrying about these things, had transformed the world from the 1960s, and even more so today compared to then. But we had an Exchange Act that was written in 1934, and the conditions that it was written to govern. And the Act has evolved and kept pace through the SEC's efforts and wonderfully, but it still was written for a time when you were Pony Express era, and so I thought the electronic trading was something that was reliable enough and observable enough that it offered new alternatives for making markets efficient and accessible. And so to me it was a compliment, just as the SEC under John Shadd pioneered EDGAR.
Which came online during
my time. We made everybody use EDGAR once they had finally finished building the system. But so we were making disclosure documents accessible. Why shouldn't we make trading accessible? And I think it was a triumph of the SEC's ability to evolve, take a statute that's decades old and out of date in many respects, preserve all the principles, but apply them in a new way to keep moving forward.
I want to talk about, speaking of making things accessible and changing with the times, I want to talk about a couple of rules that came in late, but were pretty significant.
I have to tell you before we do that about EDGAR.
Sure.
So during my 5 years in the White House and all the time of the Bush Task Group, John Shadd was chairman of the SEC, and again, a wonderful, wonderful person who sadly died too young. Not as young as Linda Quinn, but John was an outstanding chairman, pioneered shelf registrations, a lot of innovations, Anyway, during my White House years, every time we would have a meeting with the task force, he would come in and he'd start telling me very enthusiastic, and John would get all worked up. And he was very enthusiastic about Edgar and how Edgar was coming, and Edgar was going to make everything efficient and accessible. And in the old days, pre-Edgar, if you wanted to see a prospectus, I mean, they got physically filed. I used to have to carry them down on the Eastern Airlines shuttle and file physical 12 copies of a prospectus and get it stamped. And then they would put it in a mail cart where it would sit for who knows how many days before they would walk around the commission doling out the copies of this. And people, when the SEC would finish, it would send these documents to 3,000 public libraries around the United States, and people then could go to their local library to read a document that is now months and months and months out of date. And so John is talking all about, we're going to make all this electronic, you'll be able to sit in your office and read prospectus, great thing. So I become chairman. I go over, and one of the things I really wanted to do, in one of my first meetings with Jim McConnell, who was the executive director of the agency, I said, I want to meet Edgar. And he said, what do you mean? I said, well, I've been hearing about Edgar from John Shadd for 5-6 years now. I want to meet him. And so we go off. He said, when? I said, this is a good time. Let's go find him. And so he dutifully leads me down. And Edgar was a big mainframe computer at the time. And Edgar is sitting in the basement at the SEC's building, humming away. And I remember going in there and looking around. Okay, this is great. Nice to see you, Edgar. I said to Jim McConnell, I said, by the way, what's above us here? What's on the floor above us? Which I knew the answer, but the answer was there was a delicatessen that had been rented out in the ground floor of the SEC's building to generate $300 of rent or something. And so the first time that a hamburger caught fire, or grease fire, in the delicatessen, the DC Fire Department would have come in, turned on the hoses, and all that water would have gone right down on top of Edgar, would have knocked out the entire disclosure system of the United States. And I said, you know, we really need to move Edgar, either put him on the top floor, or even better, there was no backup power. It was vulnerable to flooding. It had all these, it wasn't cooled properly. They had all these big fans set up. The thing could melt down. I mean, they'd done this extraordinary work to create something that truly revolutionized disclosure. And yet it was vulnerable. We were talking earlier about earthquakes in San Francisco. Well, the damage of one hamburger on fire would have done to the whole country would have outweighed that by 1,000 times. I called up the Bill Seidman, who was chairman of the FDIC and who I knew very, very well, was a good friend, and asked him if he had any, happened to have any computer centers handy. And he's locally, and told him what I was looking for, and it turned out the National Bank of Washington had been closed, and unusually it had been a payoff of depositors rather than a merger of banks. And so the FDIC was left with a brand new computer center in Alexandria, Virginia, that the National Bank of Washington had spent $25 million building, and they didn't know what to do with it. And it had backup power, it had air conditioning, it had, you know, everything. So we moved, we got a 50-year lease at $5 a foot, and we got it essentially for free, and moved Edgar over there, and he's been happy ever since.
Much better place for him. Let's talk about, continue with Corp Fin a little bit. A couple of rules in 1992. You had you have a set of small business rules, which appear to be related to the overall economy of the times. And there's also the proxy rules. I want to talk about both of those.
Okay.
And your role in those.
Both very different, very, very different issues. Well, we talked about 144A earlier and the innovations there, and just I think in many ways for me, as chairman, with my background, I grew up working on IPOs and working on offerings every day of the week. That was my law practice. And so for me, Corp Fin was bread and butter, was the heart of the commission's role. And with no disrespect to any of the other divisions, but the reason the SEC, the core reason the SEC exists was to have the protections of disclosure and both in connection with an offering and continuous disclosure. So that was an area that I knew a lot about. I was very interested. Long before we got to the small business and proxy rules, we, in addition to 144A, we did there were a lot of changes in the M&A world. And one of the things that Linda Quinn and I had very early on in that domain, again, on a theme of modernizing and how you adapt to internationalization. So Ford Motor Company decided to make a tender offer for Jaguar, the car manufacturer in Europe. Not something that worked out terribly well for either Ford or Jaguar in later years, but that's a different story. But and it turned out that a large portion of the shareholders, Jaguar is a UK company with a lot of UK shareholders, but a large portion of its shareholders were also in the US. And the US had the Williams Act, which provided if you make a tender offer, there are certain time periods that you must observe. You have to, within so many days, do this, and then so many days do that. And when you acquire 5%, you have to make a disclosure. I mean, so there's some of it is mechanical, of how an offering has to be conducted in minimum time periods so that shareholders are not unduly coerced. You want to be sure that they have enough time to evaluate the offer, evaluate the response from the company who says, no, we're worth far more than that. Well, this guy's offering a 10% or 20% or 30% premium, but the target says, no, they're trying to steal you blind, we're really worth much more. And so, the process includes time periods to make sure that shareholders get the disclosure documents, have time to think about them and act. Well, in the UK, they had an SRO called the Takeover Panel, which are private sector lawyers and bankers in the City of London who, on a rotation basis, they go on the panel for a year or two or three, and then they rotate off. And the Takeover Panel had a statutory basis, but basically wrote its own rules. Their rules were the mirror opposite of ours. If ours said you have to make an offer and leave it open 60 days, or you have to wait 60 days before you do something, their statute said you have to do it and then wait 60 days. And so you could not physically, the world's most talented lawyer, you could not comply with both. And that was a problem, because then it essentially meant that an American company couldn't make a hostile takeover offer for a UK company. And now the UK, one of the few, and if it was France or Germany or Italy, they would have been very happy with that outcome. But credit to the UK people, they believed, as the US did, that an open market for corporate control was very much in the interests of a dynamic economy. But we had this problem, and you couldn't do both, and if you made an offer to half the shareholders and you got half the votes, well, you're only really ending up with a quarter. And so Linda and I got on the phone to the Takeover Panel and called them up and said, here we are. Introduced ourselves and explained the problem. Here we have this offer, and your rule says this, and our rule says that, and we talked it through, and the UK often talks a great game about how flexible their regulations are, but they aren't always bold in changing the way they do things. Anyway, long story short, we ultimately ended up modifying by order our Williams Act procedures to dovetail it the Brits changed some things, we changed more to make it possible for Ford to make that offer for Jaguar, which was successful. They ended up buying the company. But it was the first of its kind of a trans-border tender offer, and operating in and needing to operate in multiple markets where different regulators had different rules. It was something Michael Mann and I later, and Linda Quinn, worked on in IOSCO also to try and get people sensitive in these other countries that we needed to be able to harmonize processes that, when it's just a question of timetables and deadlines and so on, that when you're dealing with an international offer, you have to be able to change the rules. And Linda Quinn was a genius at this kind of thing. I mean, she had she'd worked for many years at Sullivan and Cromwell. She was a superb technical lawyer. She understood every spot where somebody would need a piece of paper or need a sign-off, and where the liability, if something wasn't done right, would be created. But she also had a public policy viewpoint of understanding, all right, we're here to enable markets, not to curtail them. And where there is a legitimate business purpose, we want to try and encourage that. And Ford Jaguar was one of the ways. Multi-jurisdiction offering system with Canada was another. And I can remember, poor Linda, we had one time AT&T bought National Cash Register. They had a pooling issue, a pooling of accounting issue. And its pooling is at the time, was determined whether goodwill had to be capitalized or whether you could write it off. And very, very stringent of when you could write it off. And companies hated having this long tail of amortization of goodwill. I remember the chairman of AT&T calling me and complaining about that the CorpFin staff was being sticks in the mud, and it might not have been the exact phrase he used, but that they were holding up his deal for NCR, and they had a $4 billion goodwill, which seemed large then. Today, not so bad. And these very hyper-technical standards of what you had to do, what would destroy pooling. And if you read a newspaper after 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday, it could destroy your eligibility for pooling, or if you paid a dividend at the wrong time. And a lot of technical, and they had tripped over one of the standards. Oh, we really need to do a pooling. We really need to. And Linda was, and I can't actually remember. I think we did give it to him in that case, but I'm not 100% certain of it. What I do remember very well is telling Linda and having her participate in the conversation, and then her saying, all right, I'm going to go talk to the branch chief and the reviewer, and I've got to make sure that we're not just woodenly applying this rule. Actually, now that I think about it, I think she later came back and said, okay, we've studied it carefully, and they don't deserve pooling, and here's why. And she had not just the mechanical case, but why it wasn't appropriate. So in general, I was blessed in CorpFin because I had not only Linda Quinn, I had Elise Walter, a future acting chairman of the commission, future commissioner, dominating, terrific intellect, and a wonderful person. I had Meredith Cross helping with the proxy rules and other things. And I hate to, you mentioned some names, you are inevitably slighting others by not mentioning them, but the team at CorpFin was terrific. And they did wonderful things during that era, and my direction to them was, fine, let's be sure we make the process of issuing securities and the process of being a public company as efficient as possible, because we should have a preference to have companies go public. They're free to remain private companies if they want, but having the American public able to own a piece of Apple or Google or IBM or whatever company is a good thing. And so the SEC should not have it be so painful to comply with all the rules that fewer people do it, or fewer people can't offer securities. Now, the small business rules were born out of a concern for exactly that. Virtually all the job creation in the United States comes from companies with 25 or fewer employees. Virtually all the industries of the future come from disruptors, little companies that figure out a better way to do something, and it's not the big established dinosaurs that come up with innovations. They're happy to just, life is good and they go along, but where the dynamism, the real dynamism in the economy is in the small business sector. Now, if you want to raise, and these are numbers relevant to 1992, not 2019, but if you're looking to raise $5 to $10 million of financing, and it's going to cost you $4 to $8 million in legal and accounting fees, that's really not a very attractive option. And we had rules that worked really well for larger companies. John Shad and Linda Quinn had developed shelf registration. So if you were General Electric, you could pump out securities almost on demand off the shelf. You had a registration there, boom, overnight you could put it out. With 144A, we made it possible for big companies to issue debt securities instantaneously. And not just American companies, by the way, foreign companies. 144A was one of our tools that we used for enticing foreign companies to try the US markets and get used to it, by giving them a route that was costless and painless, not totally costless, but relatively easy to do. Well, small businesses, we had a really big problem, and in 1989 to 90, the world's banking regulators took one of the most disastrous steps in history, modern economic history, of adopting the Basel capital rules. And I was recently rereading a speech I gave on that in Bocconi University in Italy, which we ought to put on the museum. It's a darn good speech. And collectively written by a number of my very talented senior staff. But the offering rules came about in part because when the Basel capital rules were done, it used to be that an American bank had to have 6% capital in those days against a loan or against holding a treasury security. So they were not prejudiced if they made a loan to a farmer or to a car dealer or to any small business. Then, under Basel, the world's central banks, in their infinite majesty and omniscience, which at least if you ask them, they are omniscient, and had seen fit to pass a capital rule that said, if you make a loan to business, you have to have 8% capital. But if you buy a government security, you need 0. Because they were risk-weighted capital rules, and they said there is no risk in buying a government security, no credit risk, because these rules were to reflect credit risk. Of course, there's huge market risk, interest rate risk, in buying government securities. The bond market goes up and down every day. And you can lose your shirt in a hurry with bonds. But when I later asked a leader of the banking group of why their rule didn't cover market risk, they said, well, we didn't have time to get to that. It took us 10 years to develop the rule for credit risk, and we didn't have we wanted to get that done. Well, what they did was massively distort the banking systems of the Western world. And so all of a sudden, when the US bank regulators put this into effect, a small community bank in Illinois could go out and buy $1 billion of Treasury securities and need zero capital. But if they wanted to make a loan to a local farmer, they needed to come up, every time they made a loan, they had to come up with 8% of capital against it. So naturally, people stopped lending and began bulking up in securities purchases. At the time, it was called the credit crunch, and all the newspapers, all the magazines, everyone was, there were cries from businesses all over the country. Farmers couldn't get working capital, equipment dealers, the John Deere dealer in Iowa couldn't get financing, floor planning for cars or farm equipment, whatever. The banks just walked away because they were loading up on treasuries.
And there's a recession going on in here, too.
Well, this largely triggers the recession. Okay. And so if you shut off credit to the only part of the economy that generates jobs and growth, your GDP changes in a hurry and not in a positive way. So we couldn't really control that. We couldn't change what was going on with the banks, but we did take a look at what our rules were to see if we could, at least at the margin, make it easier for smaller businesses. And so Linda Quinn and her team went through and we adapted all of our 33 Act documents and 34 Act documents to small business. So we developed a Form 10K SB, standing for small business, a Form S1 SB, and so on. And so, for example, we required 2 years of audited financials if you had revenues of less than, I think it was 25 million a year. But whatever the threshold was, 2 years of audited financials to make an offering instead of 3. And in the selected financial data, we required 3 years instead of 5 for a bigger company. Well, not earth-shaking, but could save a small business $1 million in accounting fees to reduce the look back. And I thought it was worth doing, and we similarly made 10Qs and 10Ks much simpler for the smallest companies. And it was a terribly important effort. The Commission sometimes gets set in its ways and overlooks things, is not as I think any government agency, things that are working fine, you are not your priority. You're not always re-examining them. You're looking at the next problem. And we had a perfectly great disclosure system, but it was costly. It was not well suited for small companies. And so we fixed that.
That's
made
great.
it easier.
That's a great explanation of where that came from.
That's where it came from.
I want to do the same thing with the proxy rules.
Oh,
Which,
very
as
different
you said,
issue.
it's a very different.
Yes, that's shareholder democracy. And it was very important to me. I was shocked. There was, and of course, this is an era where the takeover market had really, when I started at law practice, very early on in my practice of law, the first hostile takeover started. In fact, Bruce Wasserstein was an associate of the same firm I was, and just to prove how much better he did than I did, he has a large building at the Harvard Law School named after him. I do not, but that's all right. He deserved it. But anyway, you had a lot of developments in the M&A world and hostile contests. In parallel to that, there were people coming along saying, well, if you have a badly performing company and it's producing mediocre returns compared to peer companies, instead of waiting for Carl Icahn to come along and buy it, and then fix it fix its problems and have the profits, when he resells it, go entirely to Carl and his fund, or Carl personally, and there were lots of raiders at that time, Saul Steinberg and Icahn and many others, but they were all the same thing, a similar pattern of looking for companies that are performing sluggishly, that they thought those assets could be managed in a better way to yield a higher value. And that was the corporate control market we deeply believed in, that was essential to the productivity of the U.S. economy, that you shouldn't just sit there with a company waiting for it to someday go bankrupt. Let somebody else step in who believes they can generate more value. Well, should that be the only route for fixing a sluggish, declining company that year after year after year after year can't get it right, can't produce similar earnings and total shareholder return to its competitors? And so the active shareholder activist role was born in saying, all right, rather than buying out that company, and TWA is purchased and goes out of existence and gets recombined, and the acquirer doing that. What about, for the outside, people buying a significant block of shares and then trying to change the board, to force change? Or at least urging, putting pressure on the board, embarrassing people to say, come on, what's going on here with this company? Look at your returns year after year after year.
Institutional investors driving this too?
Great interest in institutional investors in doing this. And they, of course, were not legally allowed, and nor would they culturally do takeovers. So if they own shares of TWA and it was performing badly and it was very low return to the pension plan, and Carl Icahn comes in and buys it, and then he fixes it up and he makes 100% profit. Well, that didn't help the pension plan. They got a little premium up at the beginning, but they didn't get the intrinsic value of the company. But if they own shares of that company and somebody else, Ralph Whitworth, comes in and runs a tender offer and demands seats on the boards and gets on the board, and then forces the company to pay more attention to its returns, maybe changes out the management, the pension community, the institutional investors, are sharing in that benefit. So there was efforts that started going on, and I noticed that companies were actually using the proxy rules to attack the shareholders who were trying to rattle their cage. And Nell Minow and Bob Monks were involved in a proxy contest, or not a proxy contest, in a effort to shame, I think it was Sears Roebuck, into which had had legendary underperformance for decades and had just been declining from the 50s on. And so they were trying to focus and get all the institutional investors to cooperate in asking for a new member of the board or two, or to changes. And Sears actually went to court and sued Bob and Nell for violating the SEC proxy rules. And language in the proxy rules said if you're soliciting votes, you must deliver a proxy to all the shareholders first. And so a big company of millions of shareholders, it's expensive to write and print and mail a proxy contract. You're talking millions of dollars. And so here, and I happened to know Nell from working at OMB, and anyway, I thought it was a perversion, to put it mildly, to have this underperforming company using the SEC's rules to sue the shareholders who were trying to petition the board, who supposedly represent the shareholders, to run the company better. rather than waiting for it to be bought out as it ultimately was, not very successfully. So I said, this is an outrage, and we got to fix this. Simultaneously, the problem of executive compensation had gotten more and more controversial in the public eye as executives were getting bigger and bigger pay packages driven by equity awards. And the SEC proxy rules had not been updated in 25 years. And the disclosure standards for equity awards were not, we had extremely detailed and precise rules for cash, but the big paychecks weren't coming from the cash awards, they were coming from equities. And so we did it, we really tried to address the problem in several ways. One thing we tried to enhance disclosure. We not only tried to, we did enhance disclosure of the linkage or lack of linkage in any given company between pay and performance. So one of the proposed proxy rules was, which I asked for, was that the company had to put in a chart showing their returns to shareholders and the returns of a basket of peer companies. And they could use the market as a whole, they could use their own indice if they wanted to say, here are our peer companies. They had to disclose who they were measuring, but they had to draw a graph that showed, so that it would be easy to see pay and performance are both going up, or performance is going down and pay is going up. And at one glance, you could see the abusers. A quick aside on that one, Linda Quinn came up later after I told her, and I was very proud of this. This was, we're going to make it simple to look at a glance. And Linda said, Chairman, we can't do that. I said, why not? And she said, I said, well, actually, I probably said, yes, we can. And she said, no, we really can't. I said, why not? And she said, Edgar can't draw a picture. I said, all Edgar can do is show you words. And I said, well, send Edgar back to school, because, and graphics were exploding. The use of, as PCs came along in the early, I don't think we had PowerPoint in all its glory that we have now, but the graphics programs were coming along, and I said, by golly, we will teach Edgar to put in that picture, and until then, they can file that in the old mailroom, which actually I had already turned the old mailroom into a gymnasium for the SEC staff. And one of my better management activities to try and help the staff, but so we had the pay and performance. We asked for the management disclosure and analysis, MD&A section of 34 Act reports. We required a new compensation disclosure and analysis section to be written, so that the compensation committee of the board would have to describe why they made the awards they made to the senior management. And we required them to put their names in the proxy so that people could see Henry Kissinger or whomever it was that had signed off on, if it became an abusive pay practice, let people see, and hopefully maybe have the directors think about what they were approving. And then we amended the disclosure table to include the value of stock options. And that was white-hot controversial with the Business Roundtable.
Why?
Because options were the holy grail. It's where they were making the big bucks. And so I remember Jack Welch coming to see me 3 times. The only time Jack Welch ever thought it was important to come see the chairman of the SEC, and probably there hadn't been other times, but 3 times he came to tell me that stock options had no value. They shouldn't be in the proxy. This was outrageous because there was no value. If the stock price went down, the option expired valueless, and so how could we possibly put in that it had a value? Well, I knew through I knew personally Myron Scholes, and the Black-Scholes theory had long since been I don't think the Nobel Prize had been awarded yet, but it was there. Maybe it had been. And so, we had methods for valuing options. And I said, come on. You can't seriously argue that if somebody gets an option, 10-year fixed price option for 1 million shares, that's worth zero? Come on. Be candid with, well, no value. And in fairness to the roundtable, I think it was the CEO of General Mills at the time, was detailed to come and work with us and to try and, if we were going to change the disclosure rules, to try and make sure we really had a good handle on options. But we were going to add, I was determined that we were going to add the value of equity compensation to the summary disclosure section in the proxy, because it, in some cases, was 98% of the compensation. You couldn't, with a straight face, you couldn't say you had a compensation disclosure table if it left out 98% of the possible value. So we thought those things needed to be done to try and deal with the loss of public confidence in the markets due to abusive executive compensation. There were people saying that it ought to be regulated and the government ought to put limits on it, and there actually were some tax code proposals floated and enacted dealing with gross-ups for parachutes and putting a cap, $1 million cap on some forms of compensation for deductibility purposes. But, I didn't think the SEC could regulate it other than making sure that the facts were out on the table. And let's let companies have to, in the marketplace, defend the compensation they're paying in light of the results they're achieving. And in most cases, I thought the compensation was probably well earned, but what we needed was better transparency. Yeah. Then we had the Nell Minow and Bob Monk's problem of use of the proxy rules to stop communications intended to make the particularly institutional shareholders, to deter them from talking to one another, so that CalPERS shouldn't be able to talk to the pension plan in New York or CalSTRS or Wisconsin, even though they all owned a badly performing company and they had a legitimate right to talk about, well, what do we want to do about this? So and then lastly, there was, how do we open up a vehicle so that shareholders can make changes in the board? And the SEC rules at that time said you could run a proxy contest, but you had to replace the whole board or none of it. So it was all or nothing. And shareholders economically should never vote for that, because if you replace the whole board, you're changing corporate control with no premium being paid to the shareholders. So why should shareholders ever vote for that? And yet the rules were just all or nothing. And so I was determined to change the rules to say, if you want to vote one director out, 2, 3, 4, 5, doesn't matter. You can run a short slate, what we called the short slate proxy contest, to leave it to the shareholder who owns the company the decision of how many candidates they want to put forward, and then let all the other shareholders vote. So we had a package of these elements, and that came together in the proxy rules that were, as I say, the rules hadn't been overhauled in probably 25 years, and it was a very comprehensive package. We gave a safe harbor that I think said up to 25 institutions could talk together. As long as they all owned the same stock, they could freely talk, and no one could sue them claiming they were violating our rules. And we put the changes in the proxy. We adopted the short slate board elections, and then we just had to pass it with the entire corporate community apoplectic about it, and calling the Treasury and complaining. And I remember John Robson, Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, calling over and saying, the Business Roundtable was very upset about all these rules, and John was former CEO of Pfizer, and so he was of that tribe. And
were there challenges on the commission? to getting this passed?
No, not really. We spent a lot of time working the issue. This was one that we had to get it right. This was not something the commission could politically afford to get wrong. It's not something you could revisit every year or two to fix. This was a course correction to modernize the proxy rules. And I wanted us to be unanimous. I wanted us to make sure that all the commissioners were on board to what we were doing. So we spent a lot of time, Mary Shapiro, Rick Roberts, myself, we spent a lot of time talking through that issue. And while there are always slight differences of opinion, but I think, as I recall, the rule passed unanimously.
You didn't have to send it back to Corp Fin for adjustments or anything like that?
Oh, that happened. You know, we worked on it for a long time, and there were constant iterations and constant edits and changes. And we would meet with the Business Roundtable, and we would do a draft of something. We shared it with the Business Roundtable. They would give us criticisms. We would then talk about those. We would accept some, not accept others. And so it was an iterative process that myself, the staff, and the other commissioners were all very actively involved in. I think everybody recognized the importance of trying to do this. Shareholder democracy didn't exist at that time. I mean, to have the people who are supposedly owned by the shareholders suing their own owners for not complying with the SEC's regs was, that was certainly too far. And you were not going to take our commission and use it against the shareholders that we were created to protect with us just sitting there and not responding. And so I think it was an example of, I'm obviously biased because it was one of my most cherished initiatives, but I think it was an example of the commission at its finest. All of the divisions, but mostly Corp Fin, working to update a set of rules that were had just become outdated. They weren't bad rules, but they were dealing with things in the marketplace that didn't exist when those rules were written. They needed to be updated. And we did. We modernized it. It helped that when the roundtable went to the Treasury and said, you need to stop that. You need to fire Breeden if you have to, but you need to get, this needs to be stopped. That when they went to the White House, the president, Secretary Brady knew how the president felt about me, and that they said persuade Richard because you're not going to get around him, and the commission is the entity. Treasury can't write these rules. The commission has to do it. And we were going to have to be accountable for how we did. And I think the rules have stood the test of time pretty darn well. It's kind of hard to imagine what we would have been like without having contested director elections. Right. And if we hadn't had now certainly lots of companies wish that I hadn't given birth to the activist shareholder movement. And without endorsing every campaign and every activist, it was something that made corporate control more responsive. And our corporate governance in this country has become better as a result of those proxy rules and what we did. And it's not perfect, but boy, we made it better.
Terrific. I think I want to turn the corner and talk about enforcement.
After a quick break.
After a quick break.